This show is listener supported. You can join us and help our show grow to support more adoptees by going to adopteeson.com/partner. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 125, Stephanie. I'm your host, Haley Radke. I am so honored to bring you this conversation with Stephanie Tait. Stephanie shares her story of being adopted from foster care, her childhood growing up in a conservative evangelical family, and navigating secondary rejection via ghosting by her birth mother. We also dive into some challenging questions surrounding the complexity of adoption in the church and how we can combat that traditional white savior narrative. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are over on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Stephanie Tait. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to chat with you. I have followed some of your writing online for a while, and I would love it if you would start out and share your story with us.
Talking about adoption or anything related to adoption has kind of been a newer development for me, probably just in the last year or two. I was adopted out of the foster system when I was 3. And so I was adopted into a family that I love and adore, but I was in a culture that was very, we were evangelicals, right? We were very conservative Baptists. I came up in a culture where adoption was this very sort of one-note story. You got this great family, they love you, everything's wonderful now, and we don't really talk about what happened before. And if we do, it's sort of in terms of like, that was the bad lady, she was horrible, she couldn't take care of you, thank God you're away from her, that's the end of that. And I don't really blame my adoptive parents for that so much. I think they did the best they did with the knowledge they had at the time. There really wasn't a lot of good training or information happening. There wasn't really an idea of trauma-informed parenting yet. These were sort of the tools they were given. They were told it would be easier for me to not think about that too much. I don't think they did it to be selfish. I think they just didn't know any better. But I was raised in this environment where I didn't really talk openly about my adoption too much other than to say, yep, I'm adopted. That was it. It's just sort of a one-sentence thing. There wasn't really a story there. It was just, I was adopted. So it's interesting for me now to move into this space where I'm speaking so much more about not just my own adoption, but about systems of adoption and critiques about adoption culture and these sort of one-note narratives, because I was never really raised to have the tools for how to have these conversations. So it's sort of a new development for me, and I'm trying to figure out how to move into these spaces more comfortably.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because how did you go from the, traditional evangelical view of adoption, it's so beautiful, let's be grateful, to looking at it in a more nuanced way?
So I think what's interesting is I wrote a book that came out earlier this year about the theology of suffering, right? This idea of we're so quick to want to wrap everything up in pretty bows all the time and say, oh, this is the reason this happened, or God gave you this to teach you a lesson. And none of that resonated with me. I have a very complex story. I'm disabled. I'm chronically ill. And so I wanted to sort of dive in and look at that big picture idea of why do we want to wrap everything up in neat bows all the time and make it so pretty? Life is complex and it's nuanced, and we've got to find spaces for that again. And I think that part of that sort of naturally carried over to making me step back and look at adoption much the same way. Why are we always looking at this as such a simplistic narrative that needs to be pretty, that needs to be wrapped up in bows? I think the other half of it is that, I'm going to lose track of time, 5-6 years ago now, I reconnected with my birth mother, and I met her, and we started to have a relationship. And that brought up a lot of questions for me because when I met her, she took the opportunity to sort of introduce me to another version of my story, if you will. She is of the opinion that almost everything that I've ever been told about my background or why I was placed into the system or why she lost custody, that all of it is either exaggerated or completely fabricated. And so she sort of gave me this news story in which I was desperately loved and had this great childhood, and a few things went south and a few people sort of exaggerated how bad it was, and then I was adopted. And so it sort of forced me to confront everything I thought I knew about where I came from, everything I thought I knew about my background, and say, well, on one side, I'm hearing this, and on another side, I'm hearing this. And both of them are very simplistic one-note narratives where there are good guys and bad guys, and everything is very black and white. And none of that resonates with me at all. And I'm just kind of in the middle going, what's the truth here? So in a way, I was sort of forced to sit down and say, how do we make space for something a little more complex than I'm hearing from either side here? How do we make space for a story where maybe it isn't so black and white? Maybe there weren't good guys and bad guys. Maybe I'm allowed to feel grief about losing my first family and feel anger or upset at things that happened. Maybe I'm allowed to love my adoptive family and also feel some critiques for the way that I wasn't really given room to fully embrace who I was as an adoptee. Maybe there's a lot of both ands in this story instead of either or. And because I'm just naturally an oversharer, and because saying things on the internet is a big part of my job, it all just kind of came out into the public sphere now and has sort of triggered a lot of ongoing conversations with other people about the fact that this is not uncommon, that what I'm wrestling through right now is not some sort of thing unique to my story, that there are a lot of adoptees, especially I'm finding from this sort of evangelical Christian background, that are saying, hey, wait a minute, I was raised with this one story, and now I don't know how to make all of these nuanced, seemingly disconnected pieces fit in that single note narrative anymore.
So what was your first foray into finding out there were other people who were thinking about this like you?
I think Twitter's a fun place. I think if you are naturally a person who says too much on the internet, wow, has social media created communities that never could have existed before. It's why I struggle when people want to critique, like, oh, we've moved away from these in-person relationships. We have too many online supposed friendships where everybody's doing everything on the internet. This doesn't count. You have to go, meet people and sit over coffee. And I have a hard time with that because the internet has also created connections that you would have never found otherwise, and communities that are finding their voice and reclaiming their stories and working through some of these complex issues because it gave us a place to create communities without having to meet each other in person across state lines, across countries, across really complex backgrounds. So for a lot of it for me has been finding that community of other adoptees who have been doing this long before I have, who have been out there blazing that trail saying, hi, I don't fit the narrative of the quote unquote grateful adoptee. I don't just have nothing but good feelings about this. I don't feel like I should have to make a choice between the family I had before and the family I have now. Why can't I have both families now, just in different ways? I'm not sort of new. I'm not blazing this trail. I'm just new to the table. And Twitter has been the primary space that I've found so many other people who've been doing this work a lot longer than I have. But that's sort of introduced me to books, to other speakers, just a web of connections of people that I didn't realize how much we shared in common until we all kind of became overshares and put our stuff on blast, if you will.
Well, what I find unusual about your story is that you were adopted from foster care. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of adoptees that talk about, being like not the grateful adoptee or whatever, we're like from domestic infant adoption, and we're sort of like highlighting, that's problematic because X, Y, Z. And yet you can even look to your situation and see that, okay, maybe there was some reasons that it wasn't safe. And can you talk a little bit more about that?
So my situation is a little complex in that the short version is this. My birth mother and didn't know she was pregnant with me, first of all. I was a surprise. At birth, I was a surprise. And she had a really rare complication called cord prolapse, where the umbilical cord comes out first. And that's really dangerous because it can cut off air and blood supply to the baby. So she sees this cord coming out of her. She thought she was having back spasms. And for all she knows, this is like her intestine or something. She has no idea what's going on. Shows up at the hospital. They take one look at it, go, oh my God, put her under for surgery because time is of the essence, right? And she wakes up to the news, surprise, you have a baby, which is a crazy birth story for anybody. But this was a very young mother who struggled with drug and alcohol addiction. And so she and my birth father were pretty bewildered and decided, sure, we can make this work. We can play house. We can try to have this family of sorts. So they did their best to raise me for a bit. Things were not great. I won't get into too many details, but they decided that the best way to fix things was to have another baby. So they had my brother on purpose, and things got even worse. And at that point, my birth father's family decided, you know what? The problems in your life, it's her. It's her, it's these kids, it's this life. You can't handle any of this. So they essentially came in and convinced him, you just need to leave. And he did. He up and he left, and that's the last I know of him in my story. So there she is with 2 kids now, alone, and addiction really came into play at that point. And so upon the advice of her parents, she decided the smartest plan for keeping me was to place my little brother at that point. So she places him, he goes into the system. He just disappears for me on my end. And I'm still with her, and things are continuing to unravel. And at that point, my birth grandparents decide to make the hardest choice they've ever had to make, and they let CPS know what's going on. And they basically alert the system to the problems that are happening. The system gets involved, and I'm taken out of her custody now too. And this is where it gets really complex. My baby brother had already been adopted by a fantastic family who was, coincidentally enough, looking to potentially adopt more kids. And of course, they were already certified to, home study, all that good stuff. So they became my foster placement. And so I was with them from the get-go. And eventually they were able to adopt me too. The reason this gets complex is because there was a period of time in which I was just in their foster care. It was a foster placement. My birth mother still had some visitation rights. She blew that eventually. And then even past that, when she had lost visitation, there was still a period of time where she was doing just enough to keep continuing the case, but not enough for me to actually be returned and go back to being in her custody. So I was in this sort of limbo for a long time where I was with the family that's now my adoptive family, but there wasn't any permanency in my case yet. And it's complex for me because there are those that say, well, that's not really coming out of the foster system then. Like, you didn't get bounced around from house to house. You didn't experience sort of the stereotypical idea of what it means to be a foster child. But it's hard for me to communicate how different it is to be somewhere where you don't have that sense of permanency, right? It's not the same as like, I just went and then they were my family, end of story. It was confusing and it was complicated and it was years before everything was done and final. So I talk about coming out of the foster system, but it's not your stereotypical story of, getting moved around and having different placements. And they were my one and only official placement.
So you were with your biological brother?
Yep. My adoptive family has my biological brother and me, and I have another brother who's not biologically related, but he was actually a child that they had already adopted first. And that's the 3 of us all together.
Okay. So
I know, it's so complex.
Let's just keep saying that word over and over.
You want really complex? Growing up as a little girl, I actually didn't know that my little brother and I were biologically related. That news did not come out until I was older. I always knew that I was adopted, but I would wager it's hard for me to remember, but I would say somewhere around 8, 9 or so when it all came tumbling out that we were biologically related. I had no idea that that was the baby brother that had gone away all those years ago because, again, my parents did the best they could with what they knew at the time. And the running advice at the time was the best way to get the three of us to bond and be fully siblings and not unintentionally push out my older brother, since he was the only one that was not biologically related, was to not play up this information. So this was sort of a bomb that got dropped on us later, which created its own waves of complexity. We're loving that word today. But no, I didn't even know that we had that biological link till later. And I didn't know that he had grown up with me at all in the past until I heard that from my birth mother when we reunited. The timeline had never been clearly explained to me. So I knew by the time I got to her, I knew that we were biologically related, but I thought she had just placed him immediately from the get-go. I had no idea that she told me stories of, me pushing him too fast in his swing and everybody trying to tell me to knock it off, or me wanting to push him around in a stroller because he was my baby. And I'd tell everybody, this is my baby. And I was in love with him. She told me, the story that most people have of going to the hospital and meeting your sibling for the first time and being all excited about it and taking pictures of holding him. I had no idea that had even happened until I met her at 30 years old.
Wow. So you glossed over this a little bit earlier when you were sharing part of your story, that you had a brief reunion with her and she was kind of telling you that the story that you got was not accurate. Can you just talk to us about that a little bit and where you are at with your relationship now with her?
So we reunited, as the term goes, when I was about 30. And at the time, it was a really healing relationship for me because so much of why I struggled as a child, as a teenager, mental health wise as an adult, was I carried around this story in which I was never really wanted. I was this unplanned pregnancy that happened. And I had been sold this idea that the only reason she had even tried to keep me was for welfare. That other than that, she wasn't interested in being a parent and I was never really wanted. And I carried that false narrative around for years. And that really affected my sense of identity, right? That I was just this unwanted person. So I meet her at 30 and a very different story comes out about a woman who did struggle with addiction, but who desperately wanted to make this little family work. I heard stories of, her singing me, "You Are My Sunshine" every night. I heard stories of very typical mother-daughter kinds of things. And then I heard the story that will always stick with me of the day that she says she was headed to court because she was doing everything she was supposed to do. She was 90 days clean. She was going to show the judge she had hit all these check marks. She was really going to turn the tables on the fight to get me back. And she goes to an NA meeting. And in the course of that meeting, learns that their sort of mascot, if you will, their person that had been clean forever and ever and ever and encouraged everybody else, had OD'd and was dead. And it hits her in this meeting that 90 days clean is nothing and that she will be fighting addiction for the rest of her life. And that no matter how much she wants me back, as she tells it, that was the moment she realized, you know what? She's with her brother. She's bonded with this family. And I have so much work to do still. The best thing I can do for her is just let her have some stability and admit I messed this up. And so she goes to the courthouse, and instead of going in to fight the case, she says, fine. She says she signed the relinquishment paper in the hallway. She wouldn't even go in. She had them bring it out to her. And in tears, she signs it in the hallway. And this woman looks at me at 30 years old and says, I didn't give you up because I didn't want you. I let you go because I loved you so much. And this wave comes over you at that point. such a different story than the one I had carried around for 30 years. It was such a healing experience. And so for about 2, almost 3 years, we have this relationship. We talked regularly. She wanted to know all about my kids. I hadn't introduced her yet. I was working towards that, but was also trying to balance the complexity of my relationship with my adoptive family, who had a lot of really negative feelings towards this woman that had put them through hell for years. So I was kind of in the middle of all of that, but growing my relationship with this woman and getting all kinds of healing and feeling really great about things. And one day out of the blue, she ghosted me. Stopped responding to my text, stopped taking my calls. That was it, radio silence. And she was going through some health stuff at the time, pretty serious health stuff at the time. And so at first I thought, oh my gosh, like, did she die? But I'm in touch with my half siblings now, children she had since I was adopted, and they let me know, no, she was still hanging in there. And she had an internet presence that I could go check, and she was still alive. And it's been, I think, like 2, 3 years now since I've heard a peep from her. I have absolutely no idea where she went. I have absolutely no idea what changed. But it left me with a whole new wave of, it essentially feels like being reabandoned, right? Like I had finally met this person. And for years, I carried around this idea of, if she could only see me now, she would know what she was missing out on. She would wish that she had gotten her junk together. She would know I am worth way more than drugs, which is, a very simplistic view, but it makes sense for a kid. And you carry that around. And then I met her, and she did love me, and she was so proud of all I had accomplished. And then she walked away. And in a way, that hurts so much more this time around, because I don't have that thread of fantasy that so many adoptees hold on to, right? I can't make up explanations for why, she just doesn't know any better. She doesn't know me, or, oh, she wishes she could get to me. I can't tell myself the fantasies I did when I was a little kid, right? That she's out there somewhere trying to find me, and there's all these things holding her back. I can't do that anymore. I have to sit and stare down a much harder truth of, she met me. She knows exactly who I am. She experienced what it's like to have a relationship with me. She got the forgiveness that she wanted for everything that had happened before. And she had me sold hook, line, and sinker that everything I'd ever been told about her was a lie, and that she was just victimized by this huge system that wanted to place kids with, 2-parent households or whatever. And now I'm sort of stuck holding the bag, that I don't know how much of what she told me is true. I know some things for sure are not true, having done the work and seen some of the details of my case and done a lot of work in trauma therapy to, really remember old memories. I know some of what she told me was just complete garbage, but I don't know if all of it was. So I'm left with a very complex, again, that word, web of some parts of meeting her were really healing, and I don't want to have to give those up. And other parts, I'm realizing now, were just a complete fantasy. I think she told me what she really wished had been true. And I don't know, maybe that's why she left. Maybe she couldn't keep that up anymore. Maybe the guilt was too much. Maybe she couldn't keep the fantasy going. I honestly have no idea what happened or why. I don't know if she'll ever contact me again. I don't think so, though. I think the longer this goes on, the harder it would be to come back and have to apologize once again for abandoning me again. Mm. And if she did, I'm not really sure I would be open to opening that door again anyways.
I have a similar secondary rejection by ghosting experience, so I understand. Thank you for sharing that. The thing I noticed in your book, The View from Rock Bottom, you very, very briefly touch on adoption in this book, and you say in here that she was an adoptee.
Mm-hmm. So I was adopted, but my birth mother was also adopted, and she was adopted in a time where there was even less information available. She knew absolutely nothing. It was just, you're adopted. at least I had some semblance of bits and pieces of, she wasn't a good person. She couldn't take care of you. She had nothing. She had no idea where she came from. Nothing, no connections at all. And so that was really fun for filling out medical forms when they would be like, tell me about your family history. And I was like, good luck with that. And so even meeting her didn't give me a lot more to put on those forms. Towards the end of the relationship that I had with her, she actually did start to get some information about her background, which was shared with me. And that unraveled a whole new web of info for me. It turns out that I'm Jewish, which you want to talk about complex. Growing up in a evangelical Baptist household, I'm still a practicing Christian. I'm not going to convert to the Jewish faith, but every day I'm trying to learn more and more about, well, what does it mean to be a person who's Jewish if you're not a practicing Jew? And trying to find ways to incorporate pieces of those identity, not just for me, but for my kids. Jewish heritage is passed on matrilineally, right? So my grandmother was Jewish, which means my birth mother was Jewish, means I'm Jewish, means my kids are Jewish. So, here I am in my 30s trying to figure out how to bring pieces of that in without overstepping to the point of some kind of weird appropriation. I didn't grow up with this faith. I don't want to act like I did. But you want to talk about complex. I'm trying to fit these pieces together. And I think sometimes I'm doing it poorly, but I'm trying to figure out what that looks like.
The reason I brought that up is because, now that you've been in adoptee land for a while and you hear people talk about adoption and trauma, it's interesting how these patterns of trauma sort of repeat themselves.
That's something I've thought about actually a lot the last year and that I've brought up with my therapist. I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, not just from some of the trauma that I experienced in those first 3 years, but from some things that happened later in adulthood. And I've learned 2 things about that in trauma therapy. One is that all of those things that happened to me that I thought were disconnected, they're not. For a lot of adoptees, this holds true that because of some of the trauma wounding that happened when you were younger, it sets you up to be more susceptible to certain kinds of trauma later in life. And that's been true for me. But the second thing that I've learned in trauma therapy is that a lot of these patterns repeat themselves generationally if they're not addressed. And I definitely see that playing out in my story. As much as I think I have very valid anger in some places towards my birth mother for choices that she's made and for ways that I was hurt. And as much as I'm allowed to carry pieces that say, I didn't deserve that, and you should have made a different choice, I'm also learning how to hold at the same time this very conflicting sense of grace. I'm not sure I'm necessarily at forgiveness yet, if I'm fully honest, but at least a sense of grace that she was dealing with a very complex wounding too. And that as much as I feel these heavy things, she was feeling those heavy things. And that addiction's a beast, right? I'm blessed in a way that that's not my area of struggle, because it could be. Because for all the ways that I'm dealing with trauma and trying to unravel sort of unhealthy coping mechanisms and figure out how to move forward, that's what she was doing too. And she happened to be more prone to addiction specifically. And I can't necessarily judge the fact that I'm not an addict, because that's just, I guess I'm not genetically predisposed to that the way she was. And it's hard, again, complex, right? That I'm holding these seemingly contradictory ideas at the same time and trying to find a way to practice more both ands and less either ors. I don't have to choose between, oh, I forgive you because, you were traumatized too, or I'm really angry because you hurt me in ways that are not appropriate. They can both be true. They can both be true. And I'm trying to hold them together.
It's not easy.
It's not. It's really not. I think what's been most surprising for me in the last couple years is when I went into trauma therapy, when I first got my CPTSD diagnosis, I had not yet connected any of that to adoption, to what happened to me before I was adopted. I was convinced that it was all simply because I had spent years being chronically ill and disabled. It took me 15 years to get correctly diagnosed, and doctors sort of gaslit me through that whole process and said, maybe you're just crazy. And that was really traumatic. I had had 7 miscarriages. We'd been through all this job loss. And yes, when I was a teenager, I had experienced sexual assault. And so I was convinced that was the picture that I was carrying in with me to trauma therapy. This is why I'm traumatized. That was my trauma. I've got it labeled. It's clear. And within the first couple of weeks, my therapist just kept wanting to talk about adoption. I kept wanting to talk about my birth mother and kept wanting to talk about the things that happened when I was little. And eventually I got really angry and I felt like, look, I hardly even remember this stuff, okay? I'm aware these bad things happen to me, but it's not like I can sit here and play back a memory from when I was 2 years old, like a movie screen, right? I don't really remember it. It doesn't really count. Why are you so obsessed with this? It took weeks of work for me to even begin to admit how much all of it ultimately stemmed back to what happened to me when I was little. That I can try to play that down as not that big of a deal compared to these other things. But I had fooled myself into thinking that this sort of trauma doesn't count or that it wasn't big enough. And now in the last 2 years, especially, I've become so much more aware of how much my personality, how much the ways I relate to other people in the world, how much the reasons I got into certain situations and experienced trauma again later in life all stemmed from sort of this primal wound from the beginning, from feelings around the one trauma I wasn't even willing to call trauma before then. And so it is complex because in a way, it's had to be a process of seemingly getting worse to get better. That I went from a person who seemed to be really healthy and handling all of this, had this great perspective and was just so grateful to be adopted and everything was great. I seemed to be doing better with it before. In reality, I look like I'm doing so much worse now, but it's so much healthier. This is how I move forward towards health, right? It was an important step to not look as pulled together and on top of all of this and to recognize, no, this was a big deal. This may not seem to me on the front of my brain like it was as big of a deal of some things that came later. That's not how this works. This was the big deal. And until I start at the beginning and deal with this sort of trauma, there's no way I'm going to be able to become a healthier whole person in the end.
It is so interesting that you shared that your therapist pushed you to look at adoption because so many of us talk about going to therapy for years and the therapist is like, oh, no, adoption's not the thing, or they never bring it up. And your therapist did. Was your therapist an adoption competent therapist?
I don't know if adoption's like specifically her area, but I know that trauma and patients with PTSD is specifically her area. And so I would hope that finding trauma-informed specialists, right? Not just any talk therapist, but someone who specifically deals with a whole body, we're talking neurobiological, all the good stuff approach to trauma. I would hope that they would be good at identifying that there is a lot of trauma around adoption, you don't have to have gone through abuse and neglect and things like my story, right? You can be someone who didn't experience those things, who was adopted right at birth and had the supposedly perfect story and still need to see a trauma therapist to unravel this root trauma. It's big and it's real. And part of the reason it's so damaging is because we spend years telling ourselves that it's not. We do so much more damage in convincing ourselves we don't have the right to feel the way we feel, or that there's not even a reason for it.
I'm writing that down. I stopped to write it down because it's so insightful. We have spent years pushing it down and saying that's not real. It can't be that. And yet, even in some of your recent Facebook posts where you share about adoption in a public way, you talk about your behavior as a child. And yes, I looked
Mhm.
resilient and I looked like I was, this perfect hard worker, high achiever, performer. I'm just kind of glossing over this, but like then now looking back, you're like, ooh, maybe was those things to gain acceptance and to earn my place.
I think that's part of why I'm so passionate now about dissecting and confronting this cultural narrative we have around adoption and why I think it's so damaging. Because yes, we have these adoptees that are walking around carrying this trauma, but we're compounding that by sort of applauding these traits that we see as healthy, well-adjusted, dealing with it supposedly well. And I don't think I'm unique. From the more I'm learning, there are a lot of adoptees who experienced trauma much in the way that I did, that the symptoms of that trauma look like health and well adjusted to people that want the narrative to look that way. Oh, look, she's so bright. She's so affectionate towards her adoptive parents. The way that I'm like best friends with my mom, that must just be proof that she's completely over it, that she just loves her mom, and that that's just repaired all of the trauma that came before. The way I was, this gifted performer, I hear a lot, you're so articulate and well spoken. All of those things in my case stemmed directly from that core trauma wounding of everybody's going to leave me and I have to do whatever I can to be super special so they know A, I'm worth loving and I'm allowed to be loved. I am lovable. I'm not worthless. And B, so that I can keep people from leaving me. Even things like, wow, she's really empathetic. I don't necessarily think that that's always been a positive trait in me. I have to recognize a lot of it came out of needing to be able to read people so I could predict what they wanted me to be, so I could sort of chameleon myself into whatever that was and protect myself from everyone leaving me again. But on the outside, people would point to this who are outside of sort of the adoptee world and say, you were healthy. Those are good skills. Look, that just shows that you have one of the good stories. And so when I see people post these videos or hold up stories of, well, my friend's kid was adopted and she loves her family so much. So often I don't see what these people see. I see trauma responses, right? There was that video that went around of the little girl parroting like, oh, the first time I saw you, my heart fell in love with you. And everyone's like, wow, see how healthy and well adjusted she is. And I was like, this video is scary, you guys. That's a trauma response. That's a little girl who knows in her head, I need to say this so that I will keep being lovable, so that I will have a place in this family. I need to say what you want to hear so that you will love me. I don't think that's heartwarming. I think that's trauma. And if we're not having these conversations, we're going to continue to push adoptees into these little corners where they feel like that's the only appropriate way to behave. And so not only are they going to keep carrying that trauma, they're going to compound it by telling themselves that they're crazy for feeling that way.
I think that is one of the pieces of when an adopted person who's never connected with other adoptees, and they're not in the adoption space online, and they find this podcast by searching whatever, and they hear other people tell their stories of, how adoption trauma kind of exposed itself in their lives. And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not crazy. Like, I think that's one of the most healing things for listeners that have discovered the show just by a Google search. I want to circle back because, you talked about, being raised in this evangelical tradition, and you are still very much in that space. And, even the book you write, it's a Christian book. We're going to talk about it a little bit in recommended resources, but you have a very different view of adoption than most of the evangelical Christian space does right now. I mean, how many times do we have to talk about Orphan Sunday or
Oh God. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of tension for me here, right? Because I am painfully aware of how different some of my beliefs are, especially around adoption, than a lot of the people around me. And I get in trouble a lot. Anytime I post something critical about the overall systems of adoption or this cultural one-note narrative, my inbox is a dumpster fire, y'all. Like it's a raging dumpster fire.
Okay, tell me, what's the theme? What are people mad about? Who are you hearing from? Is it pastors, adoptive parents? Who are you hearing from in your inbox that don't want to post? They don't want to post it publicly on Facebook.
Well, I'll tattle. I'll tattle. Now, see, some of them used to try and push back publicly on Facebook, but enough people would push back at them that I think now they're afraid to get told what's what, so they take it into my inbox where
DMs. Okay,
just throw it at me and not face consequences. It is like 90% adoptive parents.
Okay,
it is 90% people that are saying, what you're saying is really hurtful to me. It's attacking to me personally because, and oftentimes, this is sort of the worst part of it. Oftentimes what follows is a paragraph of, here's the excruciating private details of my kids' story and all the horrible things that happened to them. Here's a detailed account of the abuse that they went through so that I can now prove to you, see, they needed to be adopted, which, first of all, if you are an adoptive parent, that is not your story to tell, and certainly not to a stranger on the internet to win debate points. Like, that's gross. You have a sacred duty to hold the pieces of that story for your child until they are old enough to decide who to trust that with. That is not me saying you should keep those a secret from them. That's me saying your inner circle is you, them, a licensed trauma therapist, and then the circle stops. That's it. That's the only people in that circle. Do not email a stranger on the internet, and certainly don't post publicly on the internet, which I've seen many, many times, to show, look at this damaged child that I rescued. Like, that's gross. Stop.
Where's my crown? Where's my gold stars at?
But mostly it's them wanting to express, if you are critiquing the systems of adoption, if you are promoting things like, we need to put more money into family preservation, we need to ask hard questions about racial disparities in which kids end up in the system in the first place, etc., it immediately becomes, you are personally attacking my adoption of my child. And a lot of them, well, I would say it's a 50-50 split between just straight angry, you're wrong attacks and a whole bunch of pushback that ends in this sort of question of, so I'm okay though, right? Like, now that you've seen all these stories, you, this adoptee, your job is to come in and absolve me of any guilt I feel. You can wave your magic adoptee wand over this and tell me, no, you're not one of those people. You're good. You're good. We're okay. And both of those emails are inappropriate, right? I don't get to do that. Like, if you have guilt where you're not sure if there was inequality or injustice involved in your individual adoption, again, take that up with a licensed trauma therapist. Take that up with your adoptee. Like, I can't step in and absolve you. That's not my job. But also, when I'm speaking about systems, I'm not talking to you as individuals. We're talking about bigger systems here, right? It's not an attack. I'm not saying nobody should ever adopt. I'm not saying I hate everybody that adopts. I'm saying there's a big picture systemic problem here that we need to address.
Mm-hmm. What I get in my DMs, especially on my Adoptees On Instagram, is a lot of prospective adoptive parents wanting me to give them, oh, but we're doing it ethically, so like it's okay. Like,
that's definitely a thing.
Yeah.
I've had some of those. I also take issue with ones that are meant with the best of intentions, but I get emails that are like, hi, I want to adopt. I'm interested in adopting. I'd like to adopt someday. Could you tell me how to do this ethically? Could you give me these resources? Could you give me all this information? Could you tell me and instruct me and teach me on what to do? Which is also not appropriate. And this is why, like, there are resources out there, and I am a firm believer that we need to center adoptee voices in this conversation. But what that does not mean is find your local neighborhood adoptee and then ask them to do all your labor for you, right? Like, this takes a lot of time, but also when you're asking it of an adoptee, it also takes a lot of willingness to sit in our own trauma pain, right? And be sort of re-triggered and confronted with aspects of our own story that some of us don't really want to revisit all the time. And so I understand the heart, and I appreciate, I do, that there are people that want to do it better. And I applaud that. But please do not email your local adoptee and ask them to do all your labor for you. Google. There are resources. There are lots of resources. And if you're serious about wanting to do this, go find a licensed trauma therapist or social worker and start that work now, right? Maybe the place to start is not tell me how to do this so that I'm not breaking any of your rules. Maybe it's to step back and take a whole different attitude and say, I'm going to take the steps to best prepare myself for walking alongside someone in trauma. Not how can I do this to prevent trauma for my adopted kid? That's an unrealistic goalpost anyways, y'all. That's just not possible. But how can I get the tools to be a better ally for them in the trauma they inevitably will carry?
Mm-hmm. As we wrap up, before we go into recommended resources, I want to hear how you started thinking more about family preservation.
Whew. Okay. The truth is, initially, this started because my birth mother told me that my story had been very exaggerated to me, that my case had been almost fabricated. And what complicated this was that she was able to show me that, oddly enough, the county in which I was adopted, right around the time that I was adopted, soon after, the federal government actually had to come in and investigate and had to clean some things up, because there were repeated cases of social workers who wanted children to ultimately end up with who they felt like were the more deserving parents. And they had been embellishing details. They had been exaggerating things in cases. That is a problem that has actually happened. And so at the time I thought, oh, this is proof that, she's right. I should have never been separated from her. She wasn't actually doing any of this. None of these horrible things happened to me. It was all made up. In the end, in my case, that's not true. My case is exactly what it says in my case file. And I'm, in a way, having to rework through all that trauma because I shifted over to this story where, good news, it was all a lie. I'm actually this totally healthy person. Yay. Now I'm having to go back and do the work again of, no, this really did happen to me. But it at least opened my eyes to this idea that sometimes cases happen in which the system sort of wants to slant towards adoption and not towards unification. And that was just sort of the thread that I started pulling, right? So what got me in may have been completely made up, but it did have me start pulling the thread that led to this bigger picture understanding of the enormous amount of racial disparities that happen here and just our cultural narrative again, right? That adoption is beautiful and redemptive, and it's a good thing to have these kids placed with better, more deserving, whatever ugly term you want to use, parents. Once you start pulling that thread, it's kind of hard not to see the numerous problems behind it, right? The first time I read a statistic saying that anywhere from 3/4 to some experts are saying as high as 90% of the orphans in orphanages worldwide are not orphans. They have at least one living parent. I was in shock, complete and total shock. I had never heard anything like that before. So it's one of those things where I understand that what started me down this road wasn't true, but it led me down a path of understanding that there are a lot of cases where the system is very slanted towards removing kids. And then once they're removed, it's even more slanted towards placing them for adoption. And this idea that permanence and giving kids a sense of permanence is the only highest good here, right? That the number one goal is what gets them to permanence the fastest. But in order to believe that that's true, we have to completely gloss over the trauma and loss of that primal wound of losing your first family. The only way that we can have a system that says the goal here is just to get them in a permanent home as soon as possible. And that means, in many cases, rushing to the stage of putting a judge in a situation where you have two choices. You can either return the kid or you can say that's it and terminate rights today. The clock has run out. There's no more time to continue. Make a choice. We put them in that situation because we're willing to assume that permanence, although it's a wonderful and important thing for security, is actually more important than protecting them from that loss and that trauma of losing their first family. Mm-hmm. And I am not saying, we should leave kids in unsafe situations. Every time I say something like this is when I get the emails of like, here's the horror story. Would you have given a child back to this horrific monster? That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying we should always reunify. I'm not saying we should never adopt. But if you really step back and look at the statistics, if you hear real stories of some of these cases, we do have a problem here. We are quick to assume that adoption will fix everything. So there's no harm done if we place one kid, if it's on the borderline, go with adoption because that'll fix everything. No, that's not how it works. And we are traumatizing so many kids who didn't need to be removed in the first place.
Well said. And final thought before we go to recommended resources. This is a big question. Are you ready? How do we get the church to flip that view of adoption is the best and highest? It's biblical. Save those orphans, widows and orphans. It's a family union. How do you get them to flip to family preservation first, adoption or permanent legal guardianship? No, I'm talking to my audience here. No falsifying birth records. How do you flip to family preservation is the highest order, not adoption?
Isn't that the question, right? Isn't that the question so many of us are asking? And that really is the heart of any of the work that I do in talking about adoption right now is that question. How can we get the church, especially, to flip this narrative? I have a couple of thoughts. One, there's this really dangerous idea that goes around of, you've probably heard this at some point if you've at all grown up in church, that adoption is so beautiful because it's this picture of the gospel, right? That we're adopted into God's family. And so when I see kids that are adopted, I think God uses that to show us this picture of the God. Okay. One of the things that I've tried to get people to see to flip that script is Jesus spoke in parables about a lot of things, right? Whenever there was a concept that is a spiritual concept that is complex and difficult for humans to understand, he would try to give them an object lesson of sorts. He would try to use terms that made more sense to them. So one example is he often told stories about laborers, about farmers, right? There's a story of a guy who hires day laborers all throughout the day and he pays them all the same. People know this parable. Okay, what you're saying about me, a human being person, being an object lesson for you, a picture of the gospel, would be the equivalent, based on that parable, of me saying, those guys that are standing in front of the Home Depot asking for work, I just love that they're out there asking for work because it's a picture of the gospel to me, right? Because one time Jesus talked about day laborers, so now these people are just an object lesson for me. That would be wildly inappropriate. And most people can see that. And so it's hard to get people to grasp, but sometimes something's true one direction, right? You learn in geometry like A equals B, but does that mean it equals this or that? It doesn't go both ways here. yes, he used adoption as an example for us to understand something complex. That does not mean my adoption is just an object lesson for you to understand the gospel better. That it doesn't work that way. I'm a human person, not a prop, and not a flannel board or felt characters that you hold up in Sunday school. The other thing for me is this idea of a lot of evangelical Christian culture is circled, especially politically, around this idea that abortion is this horrible thing that we need to fight because families first, families are important. We want to be, Republicans will talk about being the family party, family first policies, etc. That idea isn't cohesive with saying adoption is beautiful. Because if you believe that families are important, if you believe that God created the family to be this important unit in society, you have to recognize that anytime you pull a family apart to create a new family, there's trauma there, right? That's not God's perfect design. And so I have to say things sometimes in ways that make people really uncomfortable because I feel like it's the only way to get them to step back and think. And so one of the things I try to stress the most right now is that adoption is never God's best. And that sentence in and of itself really freaks people out and makes them angry and upset. But it hopefully allows them to hear sort of the subsequent conversation of explaining what that means, right? That can adoption be beautifully redemptive? Yeah. Can it be the best situation of all, or the best choice of all the choices left on the table at the time? Absolutely. And I want to make sure people hear me say that. Sometimes of the choices that are left, that are realistic, safe choices, yes, sometimes it's the best one. But it will never be the best. It will never be as good as a child who is born and is loved and is safe in their family of origin from birth to death the whole way through and never experiences that trauma of separation. And until we get churches to have that conversation, until we start asking them, for every dollar that you're spending on orphanages, how many are you spending on family preservation? Or for every dollar that you put into an adoption fundraiser, how many are you putting into family preservation? Right? Until we can sort of flip the script and have that conversation come to the forefront, it's sort of, I'm not really sure how to get them to see things differently, right? I can keep asking these questions, but until that catches on and more people start looking at it differently, I think we're still going to wrestle with a system that wants adoptees to be really grateful and wants them to have these beautiful stories because that's what keeps the system going.
Thank you for those thoughts. The other piece I'm going to just add about like a biblical view of adoption is adoption was to pass along a title and status and wealth. The person who was adopted was often an adult male, and it didn't even erase their heritage or connection to their original family. So there's a whole other piece of like what a biblical view of adoption actually means, like actually back in the day, what it actually meant versus what adoption is in its current state right now. Okay. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I appreciated all of those things you shared. So good. So much to think about there. Let's go ahead and do our recommended resources. And I'm going to go first. And as you mentioned, you have a book out, The View from Rock Bottom, Discovering God's Embrace in Our Pain. And I would really recommend this to anyone who is a person of faith and has really struggled with, but why are there hard things? And what do I do with that? And is God still good, even in the hard things? And if you've ever grown up in prosperity gospel of any type, this really challenges that view. And it's so thoughtful and well-written, of course. The other piece, because a lot of my listeners, we're really focused in on adoption. Stephanie has written a lot of pieces on her Facebook that are so very intricately thought out, just as you heard her, give these examples about adoption in the church. She writes these things on Facebook, and I encourage you to go and follow her Facebook page because I've learned a lot from some of her posts. We brought up a few during our interview here, so you got to go check those out. And then even on your blog, you have this beautiful piece called Why Doesn't She Want Me? And you talk a little bit more about your reunion with your first mother there. And so, yeah, there's a lot of places you can read Stephanie's work, and those are the things I want to recommend today.
The only thing that hit me when you were talking about my book is it's really interesting how much that prosperity gospel culture really intersects with this adoption stuff, right? Because so much of it boils down to feelings of, a lot of my book is helping people understand that even if they don't think they came up in the prosperity gospel, we did, y'all. There was always this overarching theme of people get what they earn. If you behave correctly, you will be rewarded appropriately and have a good quality of life. If you're smart with your money, you won't be poor, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of that carries over into the same conversations about why does the church have such a hard time prioritizing family preservation? Why do we think adoption is such a, perfect solution? Because we really have to confront these ideas that we all live in a meritocracy, that people that are poor made poor choices, that people that are addicts made poor choices, that everyone controls their own destiny, that I think if we're ever going to get serious about family preservation, we're going to have to go into some really uncomfortable places. We're going to have to really believe that we're not always in control of every aspect of our life, that bad things do happen to good people. And so we're going to have to ask, what does it look like to help keep families together with parents that we don't necessarily think are good or deserving or any of these words we'd assign to ourselves? What does it look like to break outside of this world of meritocracy and say, how can we just keep everybody together regardless of whether we think they earned it or not? Mm-hmm. So I may not talk a ton about adoption in the book, but as soon as you started saying that, I was like, wow, I really do see the themes in there even still.
Oh, there's a thread. There's a thread for sure. Thank you. What do you want to recommend to us today?
For me, it is the book that changed my life the most, hands down, has been The Body Keeps the Score.
Bessel.
Because I'm disabled and chronically ill, I'm still unraveling some of these ideas, right? That there's so much overlap between the physical symptoms of trauma and the physical symptoms of some of my illnesses. It was a huge light bulb moment and a lot of tears the day that my therapist said, you probably are never going to have a day where you can sit down with a piece of paper and say, this was caused by Lyme and then this was caused by trauma. And you're never going to know because trauma has very physical symptoms. It damages your body. I will never be able to say conclusively what's trauma and what's caused by some of my disability issues. It's all interconnected. And if anything, I'm learning to accept that trauma has probably compounded and made me more susceptible to some of my illness issues. And that if I don't deal with this trauma stuff, that there's no world in which I can just focus on my physical health and get better if I'm not willing to also deal with the trauma stuff too. It was a big light bulb for me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that book is excellent. So that's The Body Keeps the Score. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel. Oh my gosh, how am I not going to say his name right again? Bessel van der Kolk. Thank you. Stephanie, where can we connect with you online?
So I have a site at www.stephanietaitwrites.com. Tait is Tait. That's my Canadian husband's fault. Don't look at me. And I have all my social media links and everything on there, so you can find me.
That's perfect. And I'm Canadian too, So. Thanks so much for sharing your story with us.
Can I be Canadian by marriage? I'll just claim that. That sounds way better right now. I'm Canadian too, by marriage.
Sure, by marriage. Welcome to Canada. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I so appreciated it. I am so grateful to be able to share this type of a conversation with you because no matter if you're, the churchy type or not. I think having some vocabulary and is another tool in our toolkit to be able to have those challenging conversations with whoever, family, coworkers, neighbors, friends, whoever brings up like some challenging adoption views. I think listening to a conversation like this can really give us some language and some, like I said, tools to be able to help us have those conversations in a thoughtful way and to not just kind of be left flailing like, oh my gosh, what do I say to something like that? So I hope you find it helpful in that way, even if you're not like a churchy person. And I'm so grateful once again to be able to share these episodes only because of my monthly supporters. Like I would not be able to do the podcast every single week for you without their support. So thank you so much, guys. You know who you are. I think I said this already. I had considered starting to shout you out on the show, but so many of you are like private and you don't want your name out there. And anyway, I will honor the privacy and just say a big thank you. You know who you are. And if you want to join them, if you want to support the show and share Adoptees On to reach more adoptees around the world who maybe are not connected. They have never heard from other adoptees expressing the challenges that go along with the adoptee life. Head to adopteeson.com/partner. You can find all the details about supporting the show there, including how you can listen to a whole nother podcast every single week, Adoptees Off Script, where we have very candid, sometimes funny, sometimes very sad conversations about adoption that are a little more candid, a little more revealing that sometimes we wouldn't be comfortable sharing on the public feed. So adopteeson.com/partner has details for that. As always, thank you so much for listening, and let's talk again next Friday.